Welcome to our deep dive, into the world of Nayib Bukele, president of El Salvador. He's a leader who's, creating quite a buzz. And today we're going to try to understand why. We're going to really paint a picture for you of his impact and, the contrasting views about him and try to look ahead at, what might be next.
Yeah, and I think what makes this deep dive so interesting is that we're not just looking at Bukele's biography, We're really exploring that tension between the successes that he's achieved and some of the worries that people have about how he's going about doing things.
Yeah, it's a real story full of contradictions. So let's actually start with his rise to power. I mean, picture this, a young outsider, not your typical politician, bursts onto the scene and just totally disrupts the system. That's Bukele in a nutshell.
Totally. And he really understood how to use social media to his advantage, connecting directly with voters, particularly that younger generation, almost like he hacked the political system in a way.
And it worked. In 2019, he just shattered the hold that these long-established political parties had. Winning the presidency in this landslide victory, it was a total rejection of how things had been and a real hunger for change.
It's fascinating because it sort of echoes some things we've seen in other parts of the world. Think about other outsider politicians who've come in promising to shake things up right. And the question is, can they deliver on those promises while also upholding those democratic values?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? So let's actually look at what Bukele has done. His biggest achievement, I would say, is this really dramatic reduction in gang violence. El Salvador was one of the most dangerous places in the world. But under Bukele, things have really changed.
The numbers are really striking. I mean, the murder rate has plummeted under his leadership. And he took this really tough approach, implementing aggressive policies and using these kind of surprise tactics to really take down the gangs that had been terrorizing the country.
It's been this game changer for a lot of Salvadorans. They finally feel safe, and that's, undeniably a huge win.
Yeah.
But, and here's where things get, complicated. His methods have sparked some real concerns.
Right. Human rights organizations are raising the alarm, worried about the mass arrests, the prisons being overcrowded, and these allegations of abuse that are happening. One report called it a human rights crisis.
Wow. So it's pretty serious stuff. And it's not just about the gangs either, right?
Yeah.
There's this growing anxiety, I think, about what some people are calling democratic backsliding. So, think about this. Bukele's party now controls the legislature and the judiciary. There have been cases where he's used the military to pressure, his opponents.
That's right. And to give you a concrete example, look at the controversy surrounding his re-election bid for 2024. The Constitution clearly prohibits consecutive presidential terms, but a court that was largely composed of his supporters actually ruled in his favor, allowing him to run again.
Yeah.
Which really raises some concerns about whether he is eroding the rule of law.
Yeah, that really makes you think. So here we've got this president who's super tough on crime, and he's delivering on that promise of safety. But at what cost, right? Is he kind of, weakening those democratic institutions in the process? And then he throws Bitcoin into the mix.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. Bukele made El Salvador the first country in the world to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. It was this risky move, no question, but it definitely put El Salvador on the map and brought in global attention and investment.
A bold move, for sure.
Yeah.
But what was the thinking behind it?
Well, there are several potential benefits that, were being considered. One idea was that it could help integrate more Salvadorans into the financial system, particularly those who don't have traditional bank accounts. Another aim was to try to lower the cost of sending remittances, which are such a big part of their economy. So you can imagine the impact that could have.
Yeah. It sounds promising on the surface, but I'm sure there are some downsides too, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Bitcoin is known for its volatility. Its value can fluctuate wildly, which can be a real problem for businesses and people who are using it as everyday currency. And then there have been these technical issues with the government's digital wallet, which have caused some frustration and delays.
So it's a real gamble then, with potential rewards, but also some significant risks. I mean, this is the same guy who calls himself the world's coolest dictator on social media.
Oh, it's classic Bukele, provocative, attention grabbing, and maybe even a bit tongue in cheek. But it shows how he's trying to frame the narrative around his leadership. He knows that he's a controversial figure, and he almost seems to be embracing that image.
So is he a savior, a strong man? Or something in between? I mean, that's the million-dollar question we're exploring here.
Yeah, it's a question we're thinking about because, he has delivered on some really important promises like tackling crime and, investing in infrastructure. But that potential erosion of those democratic norms is a major concern. And now with his Bitcoin experiment, he's really pushing the boundary.
Yeah, he definitely keeps things interesting. We've covered a lot of ground, but we're just getting started. When we come back, we'll dig deeper into Bukele's economic policies, the impact they've had, and what challenges lie ahead. When we talk about Bukele's economic policies, it's not, all about Bitcoin. He's also been pushing hard on infrastructure development, and that seems to be having a real impact on, everyday people's lives.
Yeah, that's a great point. Beyond the headlines about Bitcoin and crime, there's this whole other story that's unfolding. Bukele's been investing heavily in things like new roads, hospitals, and schools. And those projects are starting to show some real results.
It's like he's trying to build a new El Salvador, from the ground up. And for a lot of people, especially those who felt neglected for years, this is a sign of real progress.
Yeah, think about what it means for someone in a rural community to finally have access to a decent hospital. Or for a kid to be able to go to a modern school. These are really life-changing developments.
Yeah. It's easy to get caught up in all the controversies.
Yeah.
But you can't overlook, these tangible improvements that are happening. But of course, there's always another side to the story, isn't there?
Right. Some critics would say that these infrastructure projects are more about showcasing Bukele's power than actually addressing the root causes of poverty and inequality. They point to concerns about corruption and the lack of transparency, in how these projects are awarded and managed.
So it's kind of a mixed bag, like a lot of things in El Salvador under Bukele. But shifting gears a bit, you can't talk about Bukele without talking about the international reactions to his leadership. He's certainly not, flying under the radar.
No, not at all. Bukele's actions have definitely generated some strong reactions from the international community, particularly from the United States. They've been pretty vocal in their criticism of his, crackdown on dissent and his moves to consolidate power.
Yeah, I bet they're not too thrilled with the whole world's coolest dictator thing either.
Probably not. The U.S. has even gone so far as to impose sanctions on some of Bukele's close allies due to allegations of corruption. But despite all that pressure, Bukele hasn't really backed down.
He seems to be playing this high-stakes game, almost like he's daring the international community to try to stop him.
He's very good at portraying himself as this sovereign leader who's standing up to foreign interference, and, that really resonates with a lot of people, especially those who feel that El Salvador has been, unfairly treated by powerful countries in the past.
Yeah, it's a complex geopolitical situation for sure, and definitely something to watch closely. Now let's circle back to the Bitcoin experiment for a minute. You mentioned earlier that it's been a mixed bag so far. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So on the one hand, there have been some, successes. Some people have really benefited from using Bitcoin, and it has attracted some foreign investment. But the volatility of Bitcoin has been a major issue.
I mean, imagine trying to run a business or even just buy groceries when the value of your currency could just swing wildly from day to day. I mean, that's the reality for a lot of Salvadorans.
Absolutely. And there have also been these technical problems with the government's digital wallet, Chivo, which has caused some frustration and delays. And there are still a lot of questions about whether Bitcoin is actually achieving its stated goals, like financial inclusion and reducing the cost of remittances.
So it's still too early to call it a success or a failure, I guess. But it's definitely a fascinating experiment. And the world is watching to see how it plays out.
Yeah, it's a bold move.
All right.
And only time will tell if it pays off for El Salvador.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive,
Yeah.
From Bukele's rise to power and his, controversial tactics, to his really ambitious economic plans and that strained relationship with the international community. It's clear that he's a complex and enigmatic figure.
He really is. He's a leader who defies easy categorization. He's really popular with a lot of Salvadorans. But he's also deeply polarizing. He's made progress on some fronts, but he's also raised some serious concerns about the future of democracy in El Salvador.
He's both admired and feared, praised and condemned. And it's that complexity that makes him so fascinating and his story so compelling.
And I think that's what makes this deep dive so valuable. We're not trying to give you simple answers or paint a black and white picture. We're really trying to explore the nuances, the contradictions, and the challenges that define Bukele's leadership and El Salvador's future.
Exactly. It's about understanding the context, considering different perspectives, and ultimately forming your own conclusions. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into the world of Nayib Bukele, it feels like we're left with more questions than answers, but maybe that's the point. He's a leader who really forces us to grapple with these tough questions about power and democracy and what progress really means.
Yeah, I think you're right. Bukele's story isn't a simple one. It's messy, it's complicated, it's full of contradictions. And I think that really reflects the reality of leadership in a lot of parts of the world today.
We've seen how he's achieved some pretty remarkable things, like drastically reducing crime and, investing in infrastructure, which was desperately needed. But we've also seen how he's done those things while raising concerns about human rights and kind of chipping away at democratic norms and consolidating power in a way that makes a lot of people uncomfortable.
It's that classic dilemma, isn't it? That tension between wanting security and stability, but also preserving those individual freedoms and democratic institutions.
And it's a dilemma that's playing out not just in El Salvador, but in countries all over the world. We see these leaders who are popular and charismatic, who promise to get things done, even if it means bending the rules a little bit or silencing their critics.
And it's easy to be drawn to that, right? To think, okay, we need a strong leader, someone who's not going to let bureaucracy or opposition get in the way, to solve these really tough problems. But as we've seen with Bukele, that kind of leadership comes at a cost.
So the question for El Salvador and for us as, people watching this unfold is whether that cost is worth paying. I mean, can you have economic progress without political freedom? Can you achieve security without sacrificing human rights?
These are tough questions that we all have to wrestle with. There aren't any easy answers. But what we can do is stay informed and engage in these conversations and demand accountability from our leaders.
We've talked a lot about Bukele's actions and his policies and the reactions that he's provoked. But what about the people of El Salvador? How are they experiencing this moment in their country's history?
That's such an important question. And it's really crucial to remember that there isn't just one Salvadoran perspective. Some people are incredibly loyal to Bukele. They see him as this savior who brought peace and stability to their lives.
They see those tangible changes, safer streets, new hospitals, the feeling that things are finally moving in the right direction.
Right. But then there are others who are deeply worried about this erosion of democratic norms, the crackdown on anyone who disagrees with Bukele, this growing sense that if you criticize the president, you're an enemy of the state. They worry that the progress they've seen could be short-lived, if it comes at the cost of their freedoms and their rights.
So it seems like El Salvador is at a real crossroads, a country full of hope and possibility, but also facing these huge challenges and uncertainties. And the choices that Bukele makes in the next few years are going to have a massive impact on the direction of the country.
We can't predict the future, but we can pay attention and learn from what's happening in El Salvador and apply those lessons to our own understanding of leadership and democracy. And, the complex trade-offs that we're all facing in the 21st century.
This deep dive has been a journey into the heart of a really complex and evolving story. We've explored the successes and the controversies, the hopes and the fears that are shaping El Salvador today.
And as we wrap up, we'll leave you with this thought. The story of Nayib Bukele is far from over. It's a story that demands our attention and our critical thinking, and our willingness to really engage with the tough questions that it raises.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah.
We hope it's given you a new perspective on El Salvador and its controversial leader, and the challenges that democracies are facing all around the world.